Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are today. Today's webinar is going to be focusing on metrics in the brave new world of programs and portfolio. We have been having the journey into Agile with Inflectra series, and the last webinar we talked about was exactly about introducing programs and portfolios and how they differ in the context of projects. We will expand from that particular thing onwards today. My name is Dr. Sriram Rajagopalan. I'm currently serving as the Enterprise Agile Evangelist with Inflectra Corporation. I have my doctoral degree in Organizational Leadership and Management, MBA in Management, Master's in Computer Engineering, and Electronics and Communication Engineering Bachelorate. I also started my career a long time back as a software engineer, then continued along as a team leader, business analyst, project manager, scrum master, agile coach, and I have served in the capacity of director and vice president as well. Several certifications to my credentials, which include portfolio management, program management, project management, schedule, risk management, agile certifications, scrum certifications as a scrum master, scrum product owner, scrum developer, agile certified coach, Six Sigma black belt. I'm an instructional designer, speaker, writer, and author. And one of my recent book, Organize Common Sense, just was released, and it's available in Amazon as well at this point. And I have a lot of facilitating experience in a number of institutions in the United States, India, United Kingdom, Canada, Switzerland, Brazil, and Vietnam as well. So some of you already know me, and I just want to give you a quick introduction if you are new to the series. Today's webinar is part of the 4-part series on the 4th webinar series. So this is the second webinar in our 4th series. Each webinar is approximately an hour long. We may reserve time at the end for questions. And sometimes we may introduce the concept using a tool. And in today's session, I'm not introducing any specific tool per se. So the 4th series consisted of 4 different webinars. First one was top 5 techniques to manage programs and portfolios, where we introduced programs and portfolios and some of the 5 important techniques, which we concluded on February 7th. Now we are focusing today on the metrics in the brand new world of programs and portfolios. And a couple more sessions are actually queued up on February 27th and March 10th as well. So we live in a world where there are so many types of matrices. Several months back, I published a blog article, and it said something like, if data is king, then data analysis is the queen. With big data and Internet of Things creating so much volume of data, it seems we jump into analyzing everything and reporting on many things, right? And as always, I remember Einstein when thinking of designing and developing matrices for programs and portfolios. And he said, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And it's a very profound and powerful statement, but it is truly an important mindset for people to start thinking in terms of what are the matrices they should be using for programs and portfolios. So it's critical for us to understand why we are measuring something instead of focusing on what we are measuring. So let's bring our memory back to what the program and portfolio actually does. And program management focuses on 5 critical areas. And these knowledge areas include how we start with the strategy alignment, how we bring benefits management into the picture, how we manage multiple stakeholders and engage them throughout the life cycle, and the governance around the processes, as well as the life cycle management of the entire program and portfolio. And these are the 5 critical elements of programs. Now, when you look at this under the strategy alignment, we look at business value and put together something called a roadmap, how we are looking in the next several years. And then in the benefits, we put together a benefits register and start working through a benefit realization plan through how we deliver projects and programs. As part of that, we engage with a number of different stakeholders and use stakeholder engagement assessment consistently and evaluate how they perform as their roles emerge, change, and new people join and things like that. And with respect to governance, we are constantly looking at change and prioritize different initiatives and optimize them using the stage gate review process. And finally, when we are looking at life cycle management, we are looking at how do we optimize the resources that are allocated to the different projects and programs and non-program operations activity, and then start looking at how risks are identified, analyzed, and addressed, right? But when we are introducing the portfolio, then we are introducing a couple more additional segments, which are going to be the performance management and communication management. And under the performance management, we are looking at how do we supply and demand with number of physical and human resources and all those things. And then we are trying to constantly see how all these supply and demand are catering to the original business value that the strategy proposed. And with respect to communication management, we are constantly looking at how all these things are coming together as part of our analysis and we are communicating, what, when, how, and all those things. So these are the critical pillars of program and portfolio management. So let's immediately start holding off for a few minutes and ask ourselves, why should we measure these critical pillars, right? In one of the James Bond movie, I'm a James Bond fan, and in one of the James Bond movie, I heard a good saying. Elliot Carver, who is the villain in Tomorrow Never Dies, said something like this: the key to a great story is not who or what or when, but why, right? And that's a very powerful statement for me because it really focuses on what we are trying to measure. However, we don't necessarily pass and find out the reason behind the why, but we quickly go into the next thing, which is called a metric. But metric itself is actually sandwiched between two important elements, which is called measure and frequency. So even if you quickly rush into this, we are actually bringing you back to, let's try to find out what the measure is. And the measure is what you would like to report as you are monitoring the progress of the project, program, or portfolio against a specific baseline. In other words, what is it that you want and how you are measuring your progress against that baseline. The metric then becomes a unit of measurement that we want to report on. And frequency is another important element, like how much time elapses between two different measurements of the same thing. Like, you are measuring temperature today and temperature, 2 hours later or 2 days later or things like that. What's the time gap between those two different measures, right? So those are very important for us to bring us back to the why, because if at the end of the day, if that why is not getting solved because of what we are trying to measure, then we are not really solving the problem, right? However, I'm sure many of you may relate to the early morning rush to the commuter train. When people ask for metrics for evaluating programs and portfolios, Sriram, can you tell me, what we should use? I'm frequently reminded of this rush, right? As I mentioned, we need to understand how the metric that we are defining and measuring will relate to the strategic alignment for the purpose for which the original program or portfolio or project even exists. If you're not going to focus on that why, then this rush is going to be a very difficult ride, right? So we have to start thinking in terms of why the program exists. And in my mind, they exist to serve three different purposes, right? One, it could be persuasive, to tell what we are developing is good or not, or whether we should be developing a new product or retiring an existing product because of the market need and things like that. Two, it could be informative for the stakeholders to tell how we are doing, more like the status quo indicators. And three, it could be an exploratory experiment emphasizing some prototype development so that we can solve a customer's stated or unstated need before it becomes a problem, right? Let's explore some specific examples over here. Okay, so on the persuasive side, we are looking at market needs, doing some SWOT analysis, developing the user stories from a very high level, epics and features and then getting into the program or product backlog size and creating a program roadmap. All these things are example of persuasive nature of the metrics that we are trying to measure. On the informative side, it could be code coverage, requirements traceability. People use velocity oftentimes, and velocity burn down is another one that we can use for an informative session as to the status quo indicators. And then on the exploratory, much more of what are some of the change approvals that we are doing, what are some of the risks that we have to constantly review and retire or add, change the probability impact assessment. What are some of the forecasting matrices, not the earned value status quo indicators, more like the lagging indicators, but the leading indicators as to how we are going to be proposed structure. So those are the earned value matrices that we will want to look at, right? So this is one way of looking at this. Now, portfolios, programs, and projects may use different metrics based on different needs. That's why it's very difficult to have one set of metrics that fit all the needs. But in the end, they should all be mapped to strategy, right? And so the strategy is the underlying thread for the project, program, and portfolio. That's the organization's very purpose demonstrated by the structure of the organization and the culture of the organization. And these are very important for us to understand, because if we start proposing a matrix that does not necessarily align with the structure and the culture, then things are not going to necessarily work out well. This strategy may be cost leadership or market penetration or product differentiation. The internal capabilities as to how we are growing the organization and the capacities, like the amount of number of people that we need to have, or the capacity of the non-human resources like facilities, equipment, materials, infrastructure, supplies. All these things should be addressed in a very detailed implementation plan, and that's where the benefit transition realization plan kicks in. And then this should be aligned and evaluated against the external opportunities and threats as well, right? So often organizations define the strategy first before creating a project portfolio or a program portfolio to reach these objectives. So as change becomes very constant, there is often a change management process that links the strategy and the portfolios, which brings us to the next set of category that I have defined as a set of 4 important tags. So metrics category in a brave new world of programs and portfolios should really focus on ensuring that the metrics are carefully identified and evaluated for the value it serves to the program, project, or portfolio. As a result, you want to make sure that some metrics are transactional, but some metrics are transformational, so some both tangible and intangible metrics to measure things, right? And then move into how you are measuring them at multiple levels. So, people, process, technology, and organization. And primarily people, process, technology, because organization embeds all those important elements, because cultural assessment of an organization is much more than what we can cover. And so people, process, technology within an organizational fabric should focus on what are some of the transactional matrices and what are some of those transformational matrices and how they tie to the project, program, and portfolio, which is where I started creating some tags based upon my own experience. First, it should be real time. How frequently it can be easily updated. So the keywords are frequently and easily updated. If you are able to come up with matrices, you should be able to keep it current. So real time. The next one is going to be simple. How easy it is for somebody to understand that matrix. So you don't need to necessarily write a paragraph or a page full of documentation to say what this matrix is. If you are, then it's going to be very convoluted and people are going to have different interpretation of the matrix. The next one is going to be valid. How accurately is it measuring what you are saying you are measuring, right? And finally, the pertinence. How much does it continue to provide the original value for which you designed this metric? Sometimes change comes into play, and what you were trying to measure at some point worked out for a period of time, and then it's no longer relevant. But we continue to measure it and continue to report on it, even though it means no relevance to the stakeholders. So these are the four important things that, in my humble opinion or my experience, that I have come up with. These are the four categories of matrices that I want to map against people, process, and technology. The goal here is not to come up with 50 different types of matrices that we can all measure, but at least a couple, one or two in each one of those categories tagged along with these real-time, simple, valid, and pertinent, so that you are able to move forward. So, it should be the matrices that you are designing as a result should be inviting. And as a result, I call them RSVP, like real-time, simple, valid, and pertinent. So they should be really inviting, that people are able to respond to it and say, well, I will either supply the data, or I will at least provide the support for you to move forward in this metric development. Okay. So when you're looking at this RSVP against the people, what we are trying to do is, again, go back to the value, right? So the value should be continuously evaluated, as I mentioned before, both in terms of the tangible benefits it offers, as well as the intangible benefits it offers. And people oftentimes ask, like, what are some of the tangible and intangible? Tangibles are very easy in terms of how we measure quantitatively something, and intangibles is a lot more about the brand equity, customer satisfaction, employee engagement, and all those things. And all those things have to be measured at the people level. People don't come pre-programmed, right? So, but people are the ones that deliver the results. It's not the programs or the projects or the portfolios that deliver the results. People are the ones that deliver the results through these vehicles of projects, programs, and portfolios, right? So program management combines groups of related projects, and it facilitates better management of the resources, which means multiple programs or multiple projects are interconnected. There may be some non-program activities that may be dependent upon these interfaces, and each interface becomes an initiative itself, like something that needs to manage, right? That's the program management aspect of it. And then on the portfolio management, we are actually looking at strategic level enterprise initiative. So it's not just I want to introduce a CRM or I want to introduce a new tool to automate processes and things like that. It's a lot more about some of those. We want to prepare for the next 5 years. So mergers and acquisition, change management, bringing technologies together, multiple technologies together, bringing peoples together. So multiple different initiatives go into place. And then programs and projects within portfolio may not be necessarily related, because as part of, for instance, mergers and acquisitions, you may be bringing people together and the process together. Some process may be related, some process may not be related, some may be retired. Some tools may not necessarily transfer. And so, you are looking at all different things at this point. So that's the portfolio nature of the dependencies. As part of this, you have to also factor in some of the operational considerations. So making sure that, what you are bringing, you are able to sustain them for a longer period of time. As you are finishing one work and moving on to the other one, the other people are able to continue moving forward. Like, you develop a software, and then that software is now completed and it's deployed to production, but somebody needs to be able to support it in help desk or customer services or things like that. So you need to look at that. And as part of that, you are also looking at the productivity. Like I mentioned before, productivity is more about whether you are able to get higher output for the same amount of input, or the same amount of output for a lesser input. So you're trying to look at operational excellence through the productivity enhancements approaches, where we will bring in additional concepts like Six Sigma and things like that. But we are focusing on what are some of those things that we have to truly work on in terms of the results, right? As a result, when you are coming up with some of the matrices at the people level, you have to look at a few things. So the first one is going to be engagement. Well, what do we mean by engagement? It's about how engaged are employees, how they are able to collaborate, talk to each other, communicate with each other, resolve problems, conflicts, and all those things. And then the stakeholder engagement, how they are able to identify risks, how they are able to come down with problem solving approaches, what new information are they bringing to the table, and things like that. And then the business alignment, all the different things that we are trying to do, how are they aligned to the business, the bottom line. So we had to go back and say, this is adding to that particular line item in our balance sheet. So we need to be able to relate to that, correlate to that. That is the level of engagement we should look at. The next one is going to be more like the delivery. Like at the end of the day, are we able to deliver on budget, on scope, and time? It's oftentimes called overshot. And then the next one is going to be, are we producing good quality? And we had talked before about the cost of quality, cost of conformance, and cost of non-conformance. How do you build quality, assess quality, internal and external cost of failure, and things like that. And then the customer satisfaction, how many customers are happy? Are they able to come back? Are they recommending people? Things of that nature. So all these things are things that we need to measure at the people level. And then the throughput, like being able to produce more, like the productivity related work. So we are looking at productivity, Kaizen approaches, which is continuous improvement, and stakeholder group health, like how many different stakeholders are talking to each other, how many of them are vendors, partners, suppliers, consultants, different business units within the organization, so how they are all gelling together and things like that. And that's part of the governance. So we should be looking at this at the portfolio level, perhaps at the larger program level as well. So those are something that we should truly try to focus on, what we have to measure, right? And the people metrics should become a bridge to the process metrics, right? If people don't follow the process, then things are not necessarily going to work out, right? So when you're looking at that bridge, not necessarily the process, but when you're looking at the bridge, you are looking at how will the current project support the business strategy, right? So your quarterly business review meeting should report on some of those initiatives, right? And does the portfolios balance the short, medium, and long-term business opportunities? We talked last time about the efficient frontier as to how you pick a particular option from a number of different options that you have to pick from, right? So what are some of the matrices that you will use to actually evaluate that? It could be net present value, or internal rate of return, payback period, and all those things. But at the end of the day, what is the ROI metric that you are planning to use? And are ongoing projects optimized correctly and resourced appropriately? Are the right people in the right place at the right time, and are the wrong people off the bus, right? If none of those things are done, then it's not going to deliver the business value that we need, because then we will be creating what we call as waste, and we'll talk about that in a process very soon, right? And then how effectively are we identifying, analyzing, and mitigating the risks that needs to be addressed, right? And do approved projects realign with changing market? As the market and the customer needs are changing, are we reevaluating the strategy and realigning the projects and the programs? Because some projects should not continue to exist because the opportunity cost of people working on some other project is lost, right? Are the right resource capability and capacity built? If the future says we need this kind of technical skills with people, or this kind of infrastructural resources, are we able to identify them much in advance and train the organization and scale the organization appropriately? We need to look at that, right? And then next one is going to be, how are these portfolio program and project delivering ultimate ROI compared to the baseline that we had originally set up with, so that there comes the roadmap and evaluation against our progress and all those things. So a few matrices that I want to throw, and as well as the RSVP tag that I basically said, the real-time, simple, valid, and pertinent. So employee engagement, the measure would be reduce employee turnover. That's what you are trying to measure, and maybe employee exit survey results as to how people are telling over there, as to how engaged they were or how unengaged they were before they chose to leave the organization, and things like that. Increased customer recommendation satisfaction would be evaluating using the net promoter score. How many people are willing to actually recommend you very highly. Productivity, reducing the waiting time. So as people are all getting cross-functional and have more cross-functional expertise, we are not necessarily going to wait for some resource to come and do the work, because all resources are having reasonably good amount of knowledge to work on them. Continuous improvement, maybe introducing something called a rapid manual acceleration, increasing the adaptation of some new software that can actually author the test case development or rapidly perform execution without necessarily going all the way to the full automation and continuous integration and all those things. Then time to market, how do we compress the schedule? So smaller and predictable increments, adaptation of appropriate framework so that you are able to come down with those kind of predictable increments. And eliminating the escaped defects. So a lot more information about the help desk volume can be gathered and say we are releasing software, but the help desk volume is increasing on certain things. So maybe we need to increase the quality of our testing or increase the quality of our documentation, one of the two. And then the stakeholder group health, other business units or vendor engagement, how they are doing, and what are the survey results telling from the partners and things like that. And strategic alignment, how are they finally contributing to the original strategic alignment that we had? So the completion of the roadmap, the different milestones that we had agreed upon and how we are progressing against them and all those things. So these are some of the things that I have basically come down with. So when you look at this, I have the tags on the rightmost column that says SVP stands for simple, valid, and pertinent, things like that, and R stands for real time. So I'm basically picking up a few things. I can't measure all of them because I'm going to be spending too much time figuring out all of them. But maybe I can measure some of them at some periods of time. So maybe I will do the Net Promoter Score every quarter, whereas I will do the partner survey, every 3 months, every 6 months. Whereas the employee exit surveys will happen, as it happens. So I'm saying okay, I want to pick up a couple of them so that I'm able to go and see how I'm progressing against them. And that's your goal. You don't want to measure all of them, but you want to measure appropriately different things at different points in time, right? The next one is going to be the process. So when you are looking at the process, it's supposed to be how people interface through the process to deliver value, right? That's our goal. So processes should not be overhead. It should not be too cumbersome, and it is not something that only a very well-informed, educated person can follow. And if that person is not, well-informed or well-trained and all those things, it's very difficult to follow. I'm not saying everybody should not be trained. All I'm saying is it should be relatively simple and should not become too cumbersome and overhead, right? So let's start looking at how this will start working out. So again, when we looked at this, it has to be against the roadmap, right? So we have project and program and portfolio, and different processes should exist at different points in time to support the project, program, and portfolio. So the project level, you can have the earned matrices, like the schedule variance, the cost variance, schedule performance index, cost performance index. If you're using Agile, you can use velocity or burn rate, things like that to measure how your iteration or how your project/phase is actually performing. You can do that as the project level. Now, as you are moving into this, your goal is, am I delivering things on time with agreed quality and with the accepted budget? Or what am I referring to, the OBO short, on budget, on scope, on time, right? So now you are moving into the next level, which is going to be the program level. So in the program level, am I delivering the appropriate functionality, not just the capability? The assimilation of all the different capabilities are now looked at in terms of what are some of the benefits, right? And those are the benefits that we had talked about, and how we are marching against those matrices. Are the programs self-sustaining? Are we able to generate enough revenue from these programs that we are able to support it themselves, right? So that demonstrates the tangible and intangible return on investment for both the benefit transition as well as the benefit sustainment. And when we are looking at the portfolio level, you are looking at alignment to the strategy. And also, what are some of the change management processes that we have in place? As the market demands change and the customer needs change, how are we having a means by which we are capturing that and using appropriate change control procedures to review, approve, reject, and incorporate the changes that are coming into the project program and portfolios, right? That's something that we need to measure the effectiveness and the efficiency of that. Right, so processes should be lean. Like I mentioned, just a few seconds back, it should not have an uneven workload distribution. In terms of lean, it's called Mura. When one person is working too much and the other person is not at some point in time, then it's going to be uneven distributions. Some people are having the wasted time and all those things. The next one is going to be the overburden of resources. So you are burdening, some people at some point in time, and that is also not necessarily good. And this could be applicable even at the computing resources level, like increasing the number of testing that happens on a particular server or particular developer machine or something like that. It could also be at the non-physical level too, non-people level too. And then ultimately, what are some of the waste that happens? Like, we had talked earlier about the downtime, the defects, the overprotection, waiting time and all those things, non-utilization of the talent and all those things that we have talked about before. So those things have to be identified so that we are eliminating the unnecessary wasting time and actually making sure that people workload is properly balanced, so that everybody has time to actually innovate and come up with creative ideas and things like that. So that the process should enable people to do that, right? So when you are looking at this, there are 6 interface level matrices that come up, like at least questions that should be prompted. So how are benefits resulting from the capabilities? Projects produce the capabilities integrated within the business. So how people are able to understand the new system that you introduced, how much additional time is getting saved, how much the productive time is increasing and the non-productive time is decreasing. All those things have to be understood. And how effective is our quality of estimation? When you are in your agile ceremony or in your waterfall approaches, you are estimating something. How good is your estimate, and what are some of the considerations that you factor in for the estimate, and how is that mapped against the delivery of the pipeline that you had actually talked about? So those things are things that we can work out. And how effectively are we managing the contingency and the management reserves for funding and payment schedule? How are we mapping all those things? So it's basically integrating the cost domain and the risk domain and see how we are actually managing all these things correctly. And how robust is our change management approach in a project delivery framework? Are you married to doing certain things only in a certain way? Are you having the open mind to adapt, unlearn and relearn a few ways? So those are things that we can look at. And how are we promoting value through both process and product quality? So process quality focuses much more on the proactive quality assurance, whereas product quality focuses much more on the reactive quality control, right? So you're trying to bring all those cost of quality considerations right here. And how are we monitoring emergent risk? Risk register at the end of the day, whether it is at the project level, program level, or the portfolio level, it's going to be just a snapshot in time. Now, we need to actually revise this, but as part of this revision process, how proactive are we to actually look at emerging risks that we have not even considered at some point in time? And how are we reviewing them, retiring them, responding them, using different tools that we talked about? A couple of tools that I mentioned last time was the sensitivity analysis and the scenario analysis. How are we incorporating these things? So these are all things that we can focus on to see what are the metrics that we can come up with. Now again, just like people metrics should be leading into the process, the process matrices should actually leverage the technical value. So when you are looking at those things, you can look at the business value, process improvement, and project health. So I'm not going to go into the details of each and every one of them, but they are pretty much self-explanatory, like the earned business value, return on investment, which we have talked several times about. On the process improvement side, what are the user stories completed per iteration? How the user stories are getting carried to the next iteration? How are we following the definition of done? defects carried over from one iteration to the other. What is our velocity? How is our backlog size? And what's our cycle time, right? From the time an idea comes into our mind to the time it is actually out. And then the project health, acceptance test per story, defects that we are identifying per story, and then categorizing what types of story it is and what types of defects are coming and things like that. Escaped defects per iteration, time taken to run the test, time to fix the test, time to create the documentation. So some of these areas is where other tools may come in helpful. Not necessarily the same tool that you are using, right? And so now I'm trying to put my RSVP tag on this and say, all right, this is SVP at one level, because it's not real time. So own business value is not going to be a real time one, but I can make it up and bring it up if it's going to be a quarterly business review where I have to present this. I don't need to make it real time, right? But other things like user stories completed with iteration, that could be real time. And a few other things, depending upon the appropriate use of tools, you can actually make it quicker too. So time to create documents. A lot of time people say, I don't have time to create the test case document or author the test case document and things like that. But as part of adapting certain tools, you can actually accelerate that process. So what are some of those things that you should actually do, right? And then when it comes to the technology aspects of it, technology should promote value. There's a very known saying that technology is a tool for the business, but not the business itself. But that's a questionable statement in today's world, because there are lots of business models that are based around technology, right? If you take Amazon Web Services, for instance, that's based around technology, right? The business model was created to based upon the technology. So they should promote value, but at the end of the day, it should adapt. It should make it easy for people to adapt this value across the organization. At the same time, enforce compliance. Unfortunately, we live in a world full of compliance. Legal, regulatory, compliance that we need to adhere to. So how are we actually promoting value within this constraints of the legal, medical, legal, regulatory, boundaries? When you are looking at this, the technology should actually sustain and develop the business. So in order for you to do that, the thinking has to change first. Instead of telling like, I use this tool is the right tool, and I'm going to bring the same tool. Instead of thinking that way, let's understand what is the thinking required for us over here. And then move into the appropriate techniques. So instead of telling like, oh, I used Agile over there, I'm going to use Agile over here. I use project management framework over there, I will use the waterfall framework over here. I use DSDM here, and I use XP. So try to understand the technique that is really required, and then move forward. And then select the appropriate tool. So all these three things are in the sphere of technology today, because lot of tools exist that promote a specific technique and prompt a specific thinking. So all these things are somewhat related, and so solve the problem, not just the symptom. Because at the end of the day, programs and portfolios are long term. They are not going to be short term, like 2 months from now I will be done. If that's the case, maybe whatever tool you use will be fine. But if it's going to be a 3-5 years time, then you are not necessarily focusing on the same tool. So just solve the problem and not just the symptom alone. So when you're doing this, incorporate the lean thinking, right? So sort, remove unnecessary things that are not required. Remove writing code that will not be tested, things like that, right? And then this is the 5 years principle from the lean thinking that I'm talking about, right? And then straighten out, establish proper naming guidelines, or include modular design approaches. So what are some of the tools that you can use that promote this, rather than you reinventing everything and then having everything in a state of mess that it adds to the technical debt, right? And then start shining. So you emphasize appropriate documentation, code check-in protocols, dashboards for monitoring continuous progress, and there are lots of tools that are available these days, right? I'm intentionally not specifying any specific tool at this point. And then standardize or Saiketsu, where you are trying to improve quality by design, security by design, improve appropriate engineering specific documentation, and all those things, right? And finally, trying to make sure that you are able to sustain this by improving the stability, manageability, and sustainability by getting feedback, which is getting into the process and into the people and bringing it back, right? So what are some of those things that you should have in place? So thinking itself is a mechanism by which you are moving into the appropriate techniques, right? So the technology should promote engagement. So engagement of people, right? At the end of the day, the people are going to adhere to certain processes and they need to be engaged. And so how are we going to look at that? So what are some of the architectural level things that we are trying to incorporate? So company policies, incorporating stakeholders, and we talked about stakeholder engagement assessment, stakeholder matrices, technical architecture and all those things before. And design and development. In the design and development, how are we actually using the modularity, designing for certain particular component and improving these? These things are all coming from the lean thinking as well as some of the Six Sigma background. So but trying to bring those things into the patterns over here. And then improving the coding quality, so fixed before writing a code. So these are all coming at the smaller level at this point, the project level, which adds up at the end of the day to the programs and to the portfolios. Introducing the process of code walkthroughs and having a structured code walkthrough, making sure that there is time for innovation or technical debt management or proper documentations. Pair with testers for additional test case reviews, or bring some quality tools, like I was mentioning before, to see if we can author these rapidly, right? Develop these test cases rapidly. Require the product owners to test against some acceptance criteria, come up with business user acceptance test criteria rather than the actual testers testing criteria alone, and come up with extreme persona to test further, how the product may be abused, and then start thinking from that aspect, right? And then automation. At the end of the day, you can have some amount of automation or limited amount of automation. As I mentioned, what are the things that you can do? So those are also things that you can actually start looking in terms of what are some of the ways technology can improve the engagement and increase the compliance with the processes. Okay. So technology matrices, when you are looking at this again, instead of specifying specific matrices here again, I am focusing on deployment. Technology matrices should actually increase the time to market, right? So deployment. So how frequently are we able to deploy to the production or pre-production or quasi-production kind of an environment? And this is where the continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline can be evaluated, and DevOps and all those things can come in too. So the time to recover from failed deployment. So if our deployment failed, how much time it took to recover from that, right? Or bring that original thing to a state of a good state. Then the change, how many user stories are changing, how many of them are getting broken down during a backlog planning, which gives you an indication of inadequate thought process going into the backlog. Backlog size, is the backlog size constantly at a place where at least 2 iterations ahead of the existing iteration, it's pretty much in a ready state, right? So at least those kind of things we can start looking at to see whether it is continuously growing. If the product is in a growth spurt, then you should actually have more stories that are tagged under the must, should, could, and won't, than not enough stories, right? And performance, as the team is actually maturing and they are performing, as our non-human interfaces that we are trying to use through different software tools are all getting better, what's the lead time for iteration? How quickly are we able to start the next iteration, and that ties with the change? And then what are some of the code coverage? So every time we are trying to push something, how quickly, how correctly that's working, so all the happy path and non-happy path scenarios are all getting tested and things like that. So there are a lot of tools that exist that can look into each and every one of those things. But at the end of the day, technology matrices should promote engagement with people in compliance with process. I've been mentioning that repeatedly over and over and over again, right? Those are the important things to bring a good holistic whole together. So that brings me to the end of this webinar at this point. Thanks again for attending this webinar. Please register for the third webinar in this series. And if you have any questions, and if you think of a question at a later point, please email me at sriram@inflectra.com. Thanks for watching, and you have a good day.